Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Healers of the World podcast. And I am absolutely thrilled to have a friend and a woman that I deeply respect on the show today. Cathy Coyle is a leadership coach, and she is a consultant for women building brands that are deeply rooted in feminine medicine. But this is not actually how I know Cathy. Cathy does a whole body of work that's less advertised, but is just so powerful, equally powerful to the work that she does with her consulting. And this is the path that Cathy walks as a Ban Draoi. And a Ban Draoi means a wise woman or a female druid in the Irish tradition. And my experience with Cathy was working with her in this medicine. I did a training with Cathy, which was a 2-year long mushroom apprenticeship in the oracular arts. And it certainly gave me beautiful insight into the wisdom that Cathy holds. So, Cathy is very well versed in plant spirit communication, somatic ritual, and vigil practices. And all of this is aimed at women, at supporting women to embody their natural sovereignty. And today I'm really wanting to share with you this old world wisdom that Cathy embodies and she holds and she teaches in this work. So, welcome, Cathy. It's so cool to have you here today. And I'm just really excited to see where the energy takes us. I would love for you to share your story with us, how this medicine found you, what it was like being initiated into this medicine. What does your
Yeah,
path look?
yeah. Thank you. Beautiful question. Beautiful question. And it's funny because I was speaking to a woman a couple of days ago who asked me a similar question. And I was explaining that at the moment I'm in the final stages of a 5-year PhD in integral and transpersonal psychology. And I have to produce a 20-page paper that's literally this question. It's like, how did you come in this instance? It's kind of like, how did you come to be in the PhD program? But it's so deeply linked to this sort of same root of how the mystery took hold of me, I guess, and how it kind of led me in a direction of wanting to understand how to integrate the deep levels of mysticism that I was experiencing into ways that it can be met in a real world situation, I guess, and also just to have this deep desire to pursue a path of study and apprenticeship. And in essence, as I've been tracking this piece, the first answer is it began as a very young child. Like as a child, I knew I had this innate sense that there was something, and I remember being probably about 4 and being taken by my great grandmother's neighbor Paddy. He had the key to a tiny rose garden that was outside of my great grandmother's home. And my great grandmother lived in inner city Cork in the south of Ireland. And there was this tiny little fenced in garden, and he was the only person with the key. And he took me in. And I can remember being really small and looking up at these giant roses, these that seemed like these mythical, mystical, dewy, scented beings, and having this moment of connecting to their light. Like I can remember this very perceptual experience of experiencing light and experiencing an intelligence. And from there, I grew up in a family that really held a lot of fairy lore. So in Ireland, we have our roots of animism are ultimately linked to what we could call the fairy craft or belief in the other folk or the Aes And so I was raised with these stories, and even, that experience in the Rose Garden was very much imbued with this more animistic thread that was held within my family lore, both on my mother's side and on my father's side, and within the grandparents, even though both my parents came from Catholic, Irish Catholic families. That thread of the myth of the other folk, these spirits, these elemental beings that reside in the flowers or reside in the mountains or reside in the trees, and the different tales that I was given as a young child. And when I was about 7 years old, I had a very clear experience of being again in my great grandmother's house. And maybe I was younger. It was probably about 6, because I remember having to go, there was like a large mirror and a dresser, and I remember having to kind of almost peek like this over the dresser and looked in the mirror, and I witnessed my face morph. Like I saw something shift in my eyes, and I was very, very young. And this became a very foundational piece for me through my childhood and through my teens, was just this sense of visioning into something other, but not really having the full comprehension or the full languaging for it, which would come much, much later. And so my journey sort of began with these sensitivities, these capacities to see slightly more than maybe other people were seeing, and the deep knowledge of this sort of other realm, which is the realm of magic ultimately. And so I started to move through a lot of big processes. And if I were to frame it now, as with all of the research I've done and all of the study I've done, my understanding is that I was being called to initiate, but in a society that was lacking the tools to identify that I had these gifts. Because in, indigenous cultures that are still intact, people would be identified at a very young age, usually around 5 or 6. They would be identified, and they would be then taken out, and they would be given a different schooling. They would be trained to be the person to carry these communal, cultural, ancestral gifts in something like what we might call shamanism, just for a useful word for us to tie into. So because I didn't have that, I started to move through basically a very prolonged dark night of the soul from about age 12. My dark night came very young. So I was around 12, and I was just filled with this consistent grief. It was so big. It felt like it was going to break my body open. And that continued for some years. And then I started to kind of move into a path of healing that came to a resolution. But as that came to a resolution, I then began to initiate into the physical body. So what occurred for me was that I basically had a spontaneous awakening in my 20s. Again, I'm using these words from different cultures just as a kind of a little bit of a reference point in, and I'll maybe explain my own perspective on them a bit later as we're conversing. But I went through something that you might call a Kundalini awakening. It was a huge movement of energy, spontaneous, came out of nowhere. And as this energy moved through my body, I had a full remembrance of myself. And funnily enough, I was actually in Africa when this occurred in my late 20s. And I had this full remembrance of myself as a female, as a Ban Draoi, as a druid, for want of a better word, standing in a grove with other practitioners. And it was like it all flooded back to me. And just like that, the memory came online. So I had this Kundalini experience. I was starting to receive these sort of visionary experiences. And this was in a time when it's not like today, when everybody's a shaman on Instagram, and, you can go online and find really amazing practitioners as well. There's amazing practitioners that we can find now. It wasn't like that. That wasn't available. But what I did was I started to explore. I started to look for teachers. And one of the first people that came my way was an American Irish Germanic descendant. She lives in the United States, called Shauna Home. And Shauna was doing a lot of work with the mushroom and channeling the fairy, or the ace she. And I sent her an email, and I said, look, I'm having these experiences in nature. I'm hearing voices, and I'm sensing something that feels like another dimensional space. And I talk to my friends, they look at me like I've gone crazy, but the experiences were so real, and they were building in intensity. And I wrote her a letter, and she agreed to have a call with me. And when we got on the call, both of us cried, because I was one of the first people. She had come into contact with her great body of work. She'd published several books, and she was quite renowned in the psychedelic-entheogenic space as a person who was working culturally with this theme of the Ban Draoi, this sort of Irish animistic fairy faith route. And I was probably the first person she met beyond herself that was having the level of communication she was having. So I started to do mentorship with her, and then slowly different teachers started to arrive, and I started to go through initiations on the land at home in Ireland with the Irish trees. So doing extended fasts, starting with 5 days out in the wild in the west of Ireland, and now my sort of norm is about 10 days out and sitting, fasting, drinking an elixir of oak or holly or yew or birch or something like this, and learning directly from the land. And so I was lucky in this place that these teachers had come. But on the other side, kind of what's, I guess, not as well known is that I don't speak about very publicly is I've been studying the occult since I was about 16. So I've been an avid disciple or, student of the occult for a very, very long time. And I had been studying anything obscure that I could find and really exploring different aspects of the esoteric, particular Western occultism, but in particular traditional European witchcraft, which is where my root really sits. Finding teachers in that lineage has not been as easy, but I feel that the teachers are, I say human teachers are maybe not that easy, but the teachers are coming through the ways that I'm putting myself out into the environment and particularly learning through the plants. And there's some amazing texts and some amazing, bodies of work around traditional European witchcraft. And ultimately, traditional European witchcraft is very much linked to this sort of belief in the other folk, belief in, and I say belief, but belief for me doesn't even feel like a strong enough of a word, because it's not a belief, because it's a direct lived experience. It's as much of an experience as the experience I'm having with you right now, sitting and speaking. And so I started to go through these series of activations, which funnily enough, much later, one of my teachers that would come into my world, Michael Dunning of the U Mysteries, he had plotted this entire initiatory process with the U, which was, if I can remember now, I can't remember the exact way he has it plotted, but it includes the activation of the heart chamber, so the activation of the etheric heart, the meeting of the shining ones, which is the other folk, and the activation of the dragon body. There's one other piece at the beginning, and when I came to his work, it was like, oh my God, this is exactly the sequence of events that I have gone through in these spontaneous initiatory processes that I was having, that the mushroom was facilitating, but the mushroom was facilitating it because, on Shauna's advice, she told me, you need to just go out. You need to go out. You need to find someone who can sit with you. You need to go out and you need to go into the wild and you need to sit with the medicine. And when I started to do that, I very quickly realized, because I'd been on this path of wanting to go into sort of more clinical psychology and real deep interest in psychedelics, had seen the power of psychedelic medicine through a process that a family member was moving through with, in a time when people didn't even really know. This was like the beginning of the psychedelic renaissance. So I knew I wanted to go in that direction, and I thought it was going to look a very particular way. Despite all of my esoterica and despite all of these experiences I was having, I still thought logical mind, you study clinical, you work in a therapeutic practice, and that was the direction I thought I'd go in. But when I started having these experiences, and based on Shauna's mentorship, I started to have these very high visionary states. And I started to understand that the types of visionary states that I was having in the wilderness, again, set and setting, but in the wild, in the mountains, in the forests, by the rivers, with both Indigenous Irish medicine, the Liberty Cap, and also with cultivated medicines, and working with particular types of strains, I started to have huge oracular experiences. In many ways, the mushroom sort of supported those oracular states to stabilize. And now mostly those oracular states can be available through breath, even working with subtler herbs like Artemisia, even working with rose, I can reach into these more oracular type states. And so I became really, really fascinated, as you know, with finding others who were having these types of experiences and call, because there's not many of us, like that's the truth of it. And so on the back end, I was moving through my own processes and then started calling in just a couple of women who were also feeling and hearing this similar call. And started to get really curious about what does it mean to be restoring the seat of the oracular, and all of the magics that come with that, the study of invocation and evocation, and the study of the history of the oraculars across the world, and the study of glossolalia, like working with language, and what does it mean to channel in maybe not in unrecognized forms and language. And then this sort of question of, but why, why would we be seeking to restore these works? And as you know, I don't really talk about this work very publicly because we're in a time where there is a lot of necessary distortion in the sort of New Age and spiritual community. And I say necessary because I think it's part of the break that's happening, because we've been so severed from these arts, and the human spirit is collectively really seeking to restore these processes. And so I've always kind of held this on a little bit of the edge. And funnily, about a week ago, I was in a process and I got this very strong call, which was like, what happens when you step forward fully into the role of the occultist in the public domain? So I can feel that there is this sort of tension starting to happen, and I've goosebumps now of like stepping forward. So it's interesting we're having this conversation today as I'm contemplating that piece.
Mm, mm.
Yeah.
Well, Cathy, huge respect, for this path that you've walked. I know personally from the work that I've done with you, because you inspired such respect in me for the vigiling practices. And from my own experience with the inordinate amount of like resource I've put into my training, the truth is nothing has compared to what happens when we go and make ourselves really uncomfortable and sit out in nature and learn to listen. And I really just want to highlight that because for those listening, I don't know if it's fully appreciated the level of discipline, the level of courage, and the level of like personal resource that you've put into the time that you've spent on the land, time that's not rushed, time where you are completely offline, time to, where there's no one knows that you're doing it. There's no certificate to come from it. There's no recognition. There's no social media post. And I really just want to reflect that back to the listeners, the amount of time that I know that you have put into the path and what it takes to really learn to listen. Something that I'm curious to navigate a little bit with you is, even as a young girl, when these otherworldly experiences started to happen, looking back now, do you feel that there was a part of you that knew?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. For sure. And I think that was probably one of the most confusing pieces, was because I knew, like, and that comes back to this piece of for a lot of people when they talk about religion or spirituality and they use the word faith, and it's like, it's not faith, like it's a complete absolute knowing. Faith implies that there is a degree of the unknowable, but there are degrees of the knowable available to women like us who were born almost like we're still intact. We're still intact with some cord or some line, or again, I use the word oracular capacity, because the oracles, they were born with that capacity. Different people have different capacities. And I think those of us, there's a really beautiful book. I always forget the name. I think it's called Sounds of Infinity or something like this. And they talk about, in that book, about witches, and they say, witches are bloodborne. And this can be a bit of a controversial belief. And I know sometimes when I speak to it, I can tell there could be a little bit of an edge of that. But my deep knowledge is witches are born witches, just like I believe shamans are born shamans. It's a very particular texture. The aura has a particular texture. The perception has a particular texture. The types of layers of reality that can be perceived has a particular texture. The symbols, the feeling, like it's this innate substance that's within. And I can remember being really small, and I know lots of women probably have this, but like playing with the potion bottles. And from a very young age, I was obsessed with effigies. I remember my father had this strange kind of African terracotta woman with these large pointed breasts that was feeding a baby. And very young, I would bring it flowers and I would lay beside it and I would treat it as effigy without any knowledge as to why. I was just drawn to do that, you know. So the draw was there and the actions were there, and the sensitivity I had to spirits was really intense for me. And thankfully, when I was in my early 20s, I went to an amazing healer. He's a wonderful Irish man called Tom Scott. He's still my healer today since I was like 21. And he managed to like seal me up a bit because it was just so intense. I would feel things as I was sleeping in my bed, standing over me. And I knew like there was always a supernatural flair to me. And that supernatural flair was also perceived by others. Like friends would call me, would identify me as witch. And that's important for those of us that are in this in-between space of not having active living lineage, we'd say, active living lineage as children, but something in our society that can even identify us, right? Something in the society that will say, she's a witch, or, oh yeah, she's like, she has weird dreams, or yeah, oh, she picks up on things ahead of time. The it's still known, the knowledge is still perceivable, and it is perceivable because we carry it. So for sure I knew, but knowing what to do with it are two different things. And for me, coming from which I discovered and started to understand much later, my grandmother, my mother's mother, was institutionalized repeatedly and unfortunately took her own life in her 50s. And I have this deep seated sense of, because she didn't fit into the norm of society at the time, and she was quite a wild and free spirit in very controlled and oppressive Catholic Ireland. And I feel it was that same fire, you know, it was that same, you could even call it that kind of Kundalini spirit, like something was moving in her. But because of this, of the system and the society, she was branded as having psychiatric issues. And I could see often what's at the heart of a lot of my work is I'm so passionate about the women who are coming online to these gifts in a system that pathologizes these gifts. And thankfully, I was able to be within a family that on some level knew, like both of my parents are very, very much in contact. My mother has a deep spiritual practice herself, and she's done very advanced study in Buddhist traditions, but has, you know, spent a lot of time in Nepal and different things. So I'm lucky I have the bandwidth is protected. My grandmother's generation, she didn't have that. And I'm conscious of all of the women in the world who have these gifts, and yet they have to oppress them or hide them, and then they can become so overwhelming that they move through the psyche, and then they move through the body, and they can make us very sick.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't grow up in a family with that kind of bandwidth at all, or community or culture, or, you know, there was no recognition of that. But having recently come out of yet another, but one of the most potent dark night of the soul periods these last 3, 4 years, where, I mean, just everything, there's just been death on every single level in my life, and so much misunderstanding because people from the outside look in and they don't actually understand the process that a person is going through. And I've been pondering that a lot, you know, because, and I'm really speaking to those listening in. I feel the appetite of the women that are listening to these episodes, is that we have the mainstream narrative of like, it's falling apart, one's losing a grip, there's a mental health crisis going on, or what have you. But to really be cognizant and to see where one can elevate that inner knowing. Because I do believe that everyone that I have spoken to on this podcast, you know, so many like yourself who have these wild stories of awakening, there is always a part of you that knows that there's not something wrong with you. It may be like a quarter of the mind, and then the 3 quarters of the mind, you know, is the programming is there. But I believe that there is always a part of the mind that
Yeah.
knows
Yeah.
that this is actually a path. And that has
Yeah.
been my experience, is walking that knowing where everything feels like it is obliterating around
Yeah.
oneself.
Yeah.
Because this the living tradition is not intact. And because it really is very difficult to find embodied teachers, even now. And so, without that being intact, I just drop this piece of contemplation for anyone listening into to trust that part of
Yeah.
oneself that knows. Because I do believe that if one wasn't on the path and the obliteration was happening, one wouldn't have that knowing. That knowing wouldn't be there. And we almost take for granted that in all these stories of becoming and awakening, I have not yet sat across a single person who has not revealed to me that at some level, no matter how young or how wild their experiences were, they knew.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And it reminds me of, as I was saying, I went through this sort of my first dark night of the soul was more in the mind space and began when I was about 12 and continued up into my early 20s. And then as that came into restoration and balance, then when I had this big awakening and I understood that these energies were that this sort of serpentine energy that was moving had been moving for all of those years, moving through all of those places and all of those parts where the being was in grief or the soul was overwhelmed by the ancestral grief or the communal grief, and it had been moving, and then eventually when it broke, it was quite intense for about a year, and then it cleared, and then following that was when I had, about 2 years later, I had the physical movement of the end of that serpentine energy and the illumination of the mind. But what happened subsequently after having this huge illumination of the mind, and I'm reading a really beautiful book at the moment called The Unfolding Self by a man called Ralph Metzner, and I really recommend it for this kind of discourse around enlightenment and the esoteric, beautiful piece of work. But after I had the illumination of mind and the recall, then I went into the next level of my initiation, which was physical, because I ended up with a severe degeneration of my cervical spine from C3 to C7, to the point that when we went to see the neurosurgeon, he was like, it literally looks like either you've been in a car crash or you have the spine of a 90-year-old woman. It was really unusual. And I had debilitating pain. I was writing my master's at the time. I had to write my master's on my left side. It was the only place I could find comfort. And I was having involuntary body movements. I had radiating pain from literally from my neck the whole way down into my toes. They were worried that I was going to have a spinal stenosis. That could have meant I could have lost the use of my legs. It was really, really, really extreme. And I went to see a second neurosurgeon, best in the country. He'd worked on one of our very famous rugby players. And so I knew he was really good, went to see him. And he basically said, the only solution for this is that we replace your vertebrae with plastic vertebrae and we fuse your spine, the cervical spine, with metal. It's going to take you a minimum of 6 months to learn how to move your head again. And at this point, I think I was maybe 28, and I was just sitting in his office, and this impulse in my body was like, no, you can heal this. And I didn't have the level of resource or practice. I'd been on a journey and I was meditating and I was doing yoga, but not to the degree I would have now. And something in my being was like, no, we can heal this. And I went into complete isolation for about a year and a half in my small home in East Cork with my partner at the time. And I literally spent my days on literally meditating. And now I'd had this Kundalini serpentine awakening. So when I would meditate, I had this debilitating pain, but I was literally seeing and flashes of light. And so I focused a lot on stabilizing what we might call in yoga the third eye, and this sort of eye center here. Really focused a lot there, and started to understand that I had a lot of fragmentation in my field and calling back soul fragments, and just intuitively went through this, and then started spending a lot of time in my local forest. The silver birch was the tree that actually really held me through that window. And I started to notice that, oh, I'm seeing the auras of the trees. Like, this was new, like actually physically seeing the auric field of the trees. Then started seeing, I'd go for coffee, and thankfully these things settled, because usually with the gifts they can get quite almost agitated and then they settle. I'd be going for coffee and I would see physical color spectrums around people. So I knew there was some illumination of my vision happening, but something in me understood that this was the process. And I started doing a lot of research on spontaneous kriyas and different spiritual disciplines and started going for acupuncture. And I did receive, they told me that there was injections into the spinal cord, and the neurosurgeon said, this won't work for you. The way that the spine is pinching the nerves and collapsed, it's not going to work. And I said, look, I'd like to try. And I got relief. And I think I had maybe 4 of them in my whole life. I've only had 4, one a year or something like that for about 4 years. And I've been completely pain-free since 2016. Like, no pain, no issues, no strength issues. There was a point where I couldn't plank, I couldn't lift anything heavier than a teacup. But there was the choice point. The choice point was, am I going to believe, because it was so extreme and the specialist is telling me that this is the path, and my mother is a nurse, so she, very much on the medical kind of spectrum, and I just said no and went and worked with healers, indigenous healers in the Philippines, and worked really focusing on acupuncture, and really got into the studying of working with breath, and really feel that cannabis and breath was a huge healer for me. I went through massive healing of myself, just lying, breathing, ingesting this medicine and letting it work on the inflammation, work on the nerve pain, and it was healed. So it's just a small demonstration of the choice point of that small voice. And it's all the times we trust that little voice, they lead us in a direction of, then the teachers come, then the practices come, because it is there and it is waiting. And if we put ourselves on the path, it'll find us. Yeah.
The reciprocity of awakening is something that I dearly believe in. And so, that has been my experience as well. It's a term that, I speak about often, but a sacred relationship. And my experience, having studied so much in the oracular and, having done ceremonial magic and then more earth-based magic, is that everything comes down to relationship, right? And when that relationship with other sentient beings is truly held as sacred, there is a reciprocity of awakening that starts to happen. And that support is there. I mean, that's been my experience. And it leads me on to something I would love to hear from you, Cathy, is to talk a little bit about the Fae and, the other folk. And then I ask this knowing that this is, we're moving into opaque territory here. But how do you understand the contract and the historic relationship between the other folk and humanity?
Yeah. It's this lens of magic. If you're one of the other, so Ban Draoi is a derivative also of the word Ban Draocht. Draocht means magic in Irish, in Gaelic. And so Ban Draocht means female user of magic. So this exists within our native language, and Irish is very different to English. It's not like the way that the language carries. Like, you would never say, I'm feeling sad. You would say, sadness is upon me, right? So even the language is very animistic in its nature. It's like, it's upon me. And female user of magic, it's like this image that comes to me is of this ability to weave with the animistic, with the layers of nature and the layers of consciousness. And this is deeply embedded in the land and in my genetics and in the ancestral medicine. One of the reasons why Ireland we didn't have the witch hunts, we didn't have I think there was like 6 women persecuted for witchcraft in Europe, and you go across the pond to Scotland, where they also had a very, very solid fairy faith, but you had one of I think the second biggest persecution of women for witchcraft. And it's because of this innate knowing. Again, I come back to this part of this innate knowing of this sort of other folk. Now, there are different theories I have if we come to this question. So if I look at If I look at some of the work from, say, Madame Blavatsky in Theosophy and some of these really great esotericists we had in the late 18th, early 19th century, and I look at Ireland, so I think it's good to maybe just look at the body of Ireland first, and then I can expand from there. And they held, Ireland was once called Hibernia, was understood as this land where people traveled to learn mysticism. Scholars traveled there. It was an island of great mysticism. And in a lot of the esoteric traditions, there is this understanding that Ireland is kind of one of the places that's holding this template still intact, this template of this connection to the other world, this connection to the other folk, which I believe was a fully global phenomena. Like I had a woman here with me in South Africa at the moment. I had an American woman who's American Irish. She was here and she's in a big apprenticeship with the ASG, and she was stunned by how the quality of magic was very much the same here as it is there. And I find that there's some, I've worked in different bodies of land, but I really feel that connection. So it's universal. I can bind it to Ireland and tell the stories through there. But when the Tuatha Danann, which are our race of mythical fair folk who arrived, there was beings living on the island of Ireland before the Tuatha Danann came. Some would say the Fae, or a version of the ASG, was already on the land even when the Tuatha Danann arrived. But if we look at the Tuatha Danann, who are the Shining Ones, and they are the inspiration for Tolkien's version of the elves in The Lord of the Rings, are very much based on the depiction of the Tuatha Danann as these Shining Ones, and they arrived in clouds, and they came down, and they were these beautiful, graceful, godlike race of, we could say, elven type or fae type beings. They came from somewhere else, and different lore says they came from what would now be modern day Romania, from Scythia, which has deep, rich, old elven and fairy lore. Or they came, the tribe of Danu, from roots in ancient Sumeria, Egypt. So we start to see these like very old threads and very old tracks of these beings who lived. It's not simply this otherworldly liminal space. We're actually talking about these beings that lived. In a body of work that's been a great influence on me as well is The Dragon Legacy. I can't remember the author's name right now. Vandermeer, I think is his
Yes,
name.
that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah. And he talks about in that book that basically elves and fae were living amongst humanity, and that there was an actual elven holocaust. And I receive visions on this sometimes. Like I actually receive visions on this moment where there was a separation. And if you come into the Irish lore, we speak about it really well, because they talk about the battles between the Tuatha Danann and the Fomorians, and how the Tuatha, they actually left and they went into the mounds, and they left the land, this side of the land, and they went into the mounds, and they crossed over into another kind of plane. So we have these stories that there was this sort of literal contact. And I think these are parts of these great epochs that we're living through, because I think that we're living through these different epochs. And if we look at it through a grander wheel of time, I think the wheel of time is that the earth, if we want to call her Gaia or Terra Gaia or whatever we want to call the physical body of the earth, she's going through these ascension cycles. And I know that one of the cycles was the Celtic cycle. If we think about the cycles of the rays, I think the Celtic cycle was the fifth ray, that there was a time when that was very dominant, that kind of more fae. If you think of Merlin and, King Arthur and the Grail, you start to see that for me is very representative of the moment between the movement away from these older magics and the handing across to the pure form of Christian Gnosticism. There was some kind of a handover, we could call it, to the Sophianic consciousness. Like there was a change that occurred. And we're kind of living on the other edge of the cycle of that handover from this deeper knowledge of magic into this more sort of Sophianic Gnostic type dominant frame, and then the distortion that came through it. So each of these epochs will have different learnings and different lessons. And my sense of it is that we are in a moment where we've learned the lessons of what it means to walk away from the magic, the feminine, the body of the water, the ritual, the reciprocity, the sacredness of rite of passage, whether that rite of passage is the passage of birth or the passage of menarche, or whether that's the conscious rite of passage, like we were speaking of taking the vigil to go out and move into individuation and train and initiate into our adulthood. We've come from this time where we've been almost in an underworld collective descent of forgetting and severing, because that's part of the initiation. If you think of a very deep plant medicine journey, there can be moments where you forget your own name, where you don't know your name, you can't orientate to where you are, and everything is overwhelming, the energy is too much, and there's confusion. So we can see that we're kind of in that macrocosmic moment of the initiatory walk of humanity, this sort of deep descent. And so my sense is that what's happening at the moment is we're starting to glimpse it again. It was so far away, and somehow it feels like it's getting even closer, whether that's the sense of, because dragons, fairy, elementals, they all exist within this same plane, and they are deeper expressions of the truth of this reality, right? The primordial forces. And one of my teachers who I mentioned a while ago, Michael Dunning, he speaks about, similar to Steiner's work, which I find this really, really interesting. So Steiner holds this teaching on the evolution of the human heart, and that humanity is basically going through the stages we're going through, the initiatory stages we're going through, the forgetting, the descent, the oppression. But in this time, we're also going through this evolution of the human heart. And he speaks about the evolution of the fifth chamber of the human heart. And something he says that always impacts me is that when the etheric heart comes online, that it becomes a sensing organ. So right now, our kind of major sensing organ is our skin. And Steiner teaches that when the etheric heart comes online, that it's like the skin and the heart become this one field, and we will be so highly attuned to life that it will become impossible to cause harm, right? And that really lands with me, because that's what I feel as we're moving through these somatic trainings, like learning to be more in the body. We start to make radically different decisions, because we're making decisions where the soul is inhabited, right? The soul is in the body, it's in the senses. And so he speaks about this etherization of the blood, this etherization of the human heart, and this development of this kind of full field of psychic capacity, that we're then becoming really attuned to each other and to the environment, and that this is the evolutionary epoch we're in as a species. And my teacher, Michael Dunning, teaches this and has received this teaching from the yew tree, which is very much the same teaching that Steiner has gotten. And in the teaching that he's received, it is that the Fae are already existing at the level of the etherization of the human field, right? So when they left, they went through some further sort of shift, because they went into a new level of density, but they're basically holding that, they call it a sheath. If you think about your own body, you've got this myelin sheath, right? They're kind of holding this sheath in place that is maintaining this heart field, right? Because they've etherized. So if you cut or damage a tree in Ireland, you take a fairy tree up out of the ground, you cut it down to build your house, you will have bad luck, because it's so appalling to the Fae spirit that you would cause that kind of harm. It's appalling. It's like, it's beyond madness, right? And so they're kind of holding that template. This is the teaching. They're holding the template of what it means to be in this fifth evolution, or the etheric human heart, or the etheric heart. And so they're holding that bandwidth in place so that it can trickle down, because it's ultimately a form of morphic resonance, right? This morphic resonance is, once it's available in the field as a database, it's available to everybody to click into. So they're kind of almost holding this morphic field or this morphic resonance in place that's inviting us to restore our true nature. And you can look at all the different traditions. You could say the Edenic nature if you wanted to look at Gnosticism. You could say your Buddhic nature if you wanted to look at Buddhism. They're all speaking about the same thing, Christ consciousness. It's all ultimately speaking about this restoration of love, right? Of this impulse to exist in harmonic resonance with the natural environment. And that for me is like what they're doing. And even then, it's not like they're this, we can have this polarized idea of, well, to be that, you would be this really good, really light being, because the Fae are renowned that they can be tricksters and they will test you, because what are they doing? And this is what I have found through initiations I've received with them. They're always testing the capacity of my heart to return to love, even when I'm terrified. That's the test. The test is like, you're only getting access to that if you can hold nothing but love and complete trust in source. Like, just nothing can impact me because I am in this complete space of trust. And that's what they're testing. They're testing to see, when you initiate with them, they're testing to see, first of all, often a big test will be around telepathy. Can we hear? Can we actually hear? And then if we can hear, they're checking, is this person safe to be able to hear? Can we trust that this person should have access to this level of information? And having access to that level of information it's all down to the testing of the human heart to see how well we can reside in trust. And I guess that's what they're there for, some level. Yeah.
That was exquisite, a really exquisite transmission. So thank you, Cathy, for sharing that so clearly. There's two pieces that I just want to concur with that. In sitting out in the wild by myself in medicine, that was the turning point. That peace around the heart and knowing that no matter what happened, all I had to do was to return to that space in the heart. And once that became embodied, I mean, I don't want to be foolish and say that I could just take any amount of medicine or put myself in any kind of situation, because obviously that's not true. But something massively shifted in my ability to walk with medicine after that and navigate different realms. That was the key. The key was the heart. And having the experience of what it felt like in the face of terror to not only return to the chambers of the heart, but open them. And so there were certain like body positions that I could use to just keep opening the chambers of the heart. And there is no safer place to be. And so I really wanted to concur with that, because that was, that's been such lived experience for me. And it's something that I apply in every facet of my life now. When I feel my body closing down, and my clients know this, I will literally go and lie on my bed in a starfish position and open. But I want to go back to this beautiful transmission that you've shared with us on the Fae, because in November, I started receiving downloads and a transmission of this book that I have written. And the title of the book is called The Great Work of Being Human, but it's actually on unity consciousness. And obviously I couldn't title the book Unity Consciousness because it just already sounds too abstract and new age before I've even started. But that is what the book is around. And so for years, I have been so intrigued by walking the path of beauty and what beauty actually means. But I really want to speak to what you shared, because what came through for me is that beauty is a signature of unity. Right. And there's something that happens in our being when we recognize beauty as a signature of unity. And the transmission that came through was really around the relational field that God is, that God is neither masculine nor feminine. God is a field of relation. And when we have polarities synthesized, there is a relational field that we call God. And the incredible gift that awaits humanity in terms of this path that we are walking is the ascension into matter, because it is the polarity of spirit and matter that creates God consciousness, that creates unity consciousness. And so you spoke to this idea that the Fae, these elevated beings, these beings that live in much greater unity, much greater beauty, because there is this reciprocity, there's no harm, are more ascended into matter. And this is what really opened for me in this work and this understanding. And what I was shown is that this is why there is such an attack by the inorganic forces around embodiment, because this is where unity lies. This is where our future lies. Our future lies in matter.
Yeah.
Our future lies in the deep embodiment of matter. And yeah, I just loved what you shared, because the more and more I fall into this, the more and more I see that what these otherworldly, and I use that word lightly, otherworldly beings are showing us is the path into matter. And this is
Yeah.
what has been so severely disrupted in this epoch, is our understanding of matter. And so many of the teachings that have been distorted, it's all around getting away from the body, getting away from the body of the earth. The idea that we escape the prison planet, right, by becoming disembodied, by ignoring the feminine. But when we ignore the feminine, we hurt the masculine, because this is this polarity, creation happens with both. Unity, creation can only happen in unity. And so that's really beautiful, because what I heard from your transmission was this path of ascension, which is actually a descent into matter, has been walked by these otherworldly beings, and they
Yeah.
hold this remembering, this
Yeah.
path for us.
Yeah.
And this speaks to this contract, because the ultimate responsibility of humans is to be stewards. That's why we're
Yeah.
here, is to steward
Exactly.
creation, to
Yeah.
steward this synthesis between matter and spirit. So thank you so much for sharing that, just so exquisitely. Yeah, I hope to hear you talk on many more podcasts about this, Cathy, because you've balanced the academic, and I know that you are so deeply versed in the academic study, and then there is just this felt knowing that you carry, and there's such a beautiful synthesis in the way that you hold these transmissions. So I find it really exciting that you're feeling this nudge to share more of it, because
Yeah, I had a funny experience a couple of days ago where I had this piece come in. I had been in big medicine, and I had an opportunity to ask an oracular question, and it was around this. And the piece that came through was like, you need to step forward and like really, really let yourself be witnessed in the form of the occultist. It's time, it's safe. And a couple of days later, I got back and I had a little submission for my PhD. It was a simple kind of weekly check-in question, which was, if you were a tree, what type of tree would you be? And I thought this question was made for me. It was made for me, and I wrote this little discussion piece about the yew. And as the yew is my master tree, and I'm in a big kind of 5-year initiation with the yew that began in November 2024. And I wrote this whole piece, and then my supervisor, who in my PhD, wrote to me and she said, does this have anything to do with the dragons? Do you find the dragons? Do you meet dragons when you encounter this? And I thought, this is bizarre. This is my PhD supervisor talking to me on a public domain inside a established institution around the link between the dragon body and the tree of life. And I thought, okay, these are the signs that something has radically shifted. And I think it's important right now because of coming out of the transit we've just come through with Neptune in Pisces, and this sort of age from about 2012 of this mass dreaming back into the sort of esoteric and the new age and all of the stuff that has happened, again being a primary impulse. But now we're moving into a place where that arc of eldership is trying to establish itself, so we can steady the field a little bit. But that's going to require us to have conversations about things that are existing within a pool of conversations that are also ungrounded. So that's the test, really. It's like how to stay. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was, you have to keep one foot in the liminal and one foot in the mundane, and that's the task. It's like, can you maintain both? Because if you fall too far one way or the other, then you're kind of losing track with what's possible.
yeah, and that really speaks to this polarity synthesis, which is if you look at the if you look at what differentiates human beings from either even animals on our planet, it's the fact that we are not beasts and we're not angelic. So we have the
Mm,
mind, the soul, and the spirit.
mm,
So we are
mm,
capable of repair. So an animal, for instance, is incongruency. There's no need for repair, but the animal also
mm,
doesn't know it, where the human knows that they are not whole and that they can become whole. And so there's an amazing clue there. If we had to look at our heritage and we had to look at our purpose, why have we been made in this way? There must be purpose to this
mm,
ability to stand on the middle
mm,
path of whatever we're talking about: spirit, matter, time, eternity, masculine, feminine, and to hold that polarity, the mundane, the liminal, as you speak. What I love about what you said there too, Cathy, about this time that we're in, is my understanding of it is that our salvation or the path is around our remembering. And the field needs to be destabilized, right? The field of amnesia needs to be destabilized. And so I do totally, just like clapping in the background, hearing this transmission that came through for you last week about stepping forward, because I really believe that we need the kind of eldership that is going to give people the permission to remember the truth, because the field is not going to be destabilized by an awakening here or an awakening there or an awakening there. The field needs to be destabilized by mass awakenings. And, all the original Gnostic teachings are all mnemonic in the language of awakening. It's never become something you're not. It's always remember what you are. If
yeah.
we look in the scriptures of all the original teachings, it's never about leaving this world or leaving this body and becoming something else. It's always like, remember who you are, know yourself, know your truth. And I feel, this is the reason for the podcast, is I
Mm,
wanted to give people the space to share their stories of awakening, because I have such a deep sense that we need to build this pathway for the mass awakening that is just around the corner. And the more that we can normalize these kind of conversations, and the more beings, wisdom keepers like yourself, step forward and feel safe enough to start sharing this. Yeah, this is the work now. So deeply, deeply grateful for your time today, my sister. I know that our listeners are going to be absolutely enthralled with this transmission. Thank you.
thank you so much. It's been beautiful to be here, and I'm really excited just for everything that's happening. And it is really important to have these pieces, because the one of the reasons why I went the path of transpersonal psychology was because I know it's going to be hard. People are going to go into spiritual emergence. There's going to be new things, new levels of awareness that aren't going to make sense. And having these little pockets of conversation can be the difference between someone not feeling isolated and alone and thinking, okay, wow, actually this is a way. And especially for women, I really feel, because we are the ones that have to be we're being supported obviously by the wider community, but we have a big purpose now to come back into the non-linear, the explorative, the mythic, the ritualistic, and just understand that just even in the process of bringing our prayers to the water, where that's accumulating, this is how it was always done. We've just forgotten for a couple of hundred years, but this is how it was always done. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.